Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
If we read the New Testament, we're going to find a lot of miracle stories there. And it's important to be able to read them in a healthy and constructive way. We should see them as signs of the presence of the Lord, but especially signs that speak to us.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father John Blazer, the pastor of St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of literary forms in the New Testament. Here's Father Bacik.
John, you and I have been friends for many years, colleagues working together in campus ministry and sharing a lot of interests, golf among them, and have a lot of chances to interact, and I'm grateful that you have taken out some of your time to be here and to discuss some serious matters. We'll talk about the New Testament and some of the approaches to that, I think always with a practical purpose of trying to figure out how we can read it more effectively, how people can get more immersed in that biblical world and find illumination for their own lives and find a strength that would transform their lives. So I think that we can begin perhaps by noting the fact that there are various literary forms in the New Testament. That notion of literary forms has proven to be a very helpful one in analyzing what the Scriptures are trying to say to us. It reminds us that all writings have a particular purpose, and the authors adopt different styles and forms in order to get their points across. It's something that we know from the world of literature. We know that novels are something different from biographies, and even though they begin to merge often these days, we still recognize the fact that there are some distinctions between various forms of writing. And naturally, since the Scriptures themselves are a particular type of writing, we can expect to see different literary forms contained in them.
And each literary form, although it is different, is trying to do the same thing, put us in touch with a reality, a truth, a religious truth. And although, again, it might seem like poetry in one case doesn't talk about truth maybe in a scientific way that we think of, nevertheless they're speaking about a reality that is just as true as the scientist can see under the microscope.
So the New Testament is trying in one way or another to get us in touch with Jesus Christ. What we have in the New Testament is the remembrance of the early community of the historical Jesus, and especially his continued presence in their midst. They were convinced that he had been raised to life, was continuing to operate in their own lives, and indeed was the Lord of the whole of history. So that New Testament was written in that light, the light of the resurrection itself, and their belief in the fact that Jesus kept his promise and sent the Spirit upon them. So what you're saying is that each of the literary forms has something deeper that unites them. That is the attempt to get the reader in touch with this Jesus of Nazareth, who the Christians claim is indeed life-giving Spirit for all of us.
That word, the Lord of history, that you used, Jim, reminds me of one of the literary forms is the miracle stories. And I really think that really the message of all the miracle stories, one way of simply saying it in a general way, is that Jesus comes out of those stories as the Lord of history, the Lord of nature, the Lord of our lives. They're very strange stories, I think, that particular literary form very hard for me sometimes to understand because it's so strange. But for people of that day, those kind of stories were stories that they were familiar with. They are not stories that are peculiar to the Christian message. They were stories of great wonder workers in other literature.
Yes, I think that it's probably good if we're going to launch right into those miracle stories to locate that a bit in the culture and specify that a little bit more. I think that there was a previous time to the biblical period when people sort of thought that the whole of nature and the whole of life was inhabited by the spirits and the powers, that miracles were just going on all the time in one way. Then in the biblical period, I think we're into a period where miracles are seen to be part of life, but sort of now and then happenings, so that you would expect there to be particular wonder workers who could do this, and at various times there would be these miraculous happenings, but it wouldn't be as though it was just a continual kind of thing or expected always. I guess we could contrast that with our own age and time, which is more secularized, where many people have no feel for miracles at all, where many people would reject any kind of miracle idea at all, where there just would be no expectation. There would always be the thought that, well, there will be a rational kind of explanation for this. There will be a logical way to understand whatever goes on in our world. So it's probably important to begin with to locate the fact that Jesus was in a period of time where miracles were expected and weren't really terribly foreign, but on the other hand were not happening just always by everyone.
I often think, though, that sometimes people are in touch with that idea of the wonder of life, that is really, I think, that this meaning of miracle that we find in Scripture. Oftentimes people will come up and something wonderful will happen to them, and they can't explain it. And they'll often say, well, it was a miracle, or something wonderful happened to me. They can't put it into scientific terms. They're going to use it, describe it in poetic terms. And I think that's the side of life, the sort of experience that we're talking about in these miracle stories.
So maybe we have to start right away by saying when the Gospels talk about miracles, they don't really mean a breaking of the laws of nature. That when people today, I suppose, begin to reflect on do miracles happen or not, it is usually in terms of does God intervene in His world and break the laws of nature that He has set up, and does God do some strange and unusual thing, usually in response to prayer or almost a magical kind of notion. And I think we have to get back to the fact that the New Testament didn't really understand miracles that way at all. The characteristic phrase, I think, is found in John's Gospel, is it not, in where miracles are called signs. The first of his signs Jesus worked at Cana. And I think that the word sign represents much more what I'd call a healthier understanding of miracle. Not an inbreaking by God or breaking the laws of nature, but a reminder that God's kingdom is present. The sign was of God's presence, the power of His Spirit, the ability of God to overcome the evil and the suffering in the world. They were signs that the kingdom was especially and intensely present in a given situation. I believe that when we begin to explain miracles like that, they might look a little different to modern skeptical people who almost instinctively reject any notion that the laws of nature are being broken, or that a God intervenes on behalf of certain people and not on behalf of others.
I think that explanation is borne out by the very structure of the miracle stories. If you look at the miracle stories, over and over again, you see a certain set pattern. It's almost like a record. There is an event. The event has to do maybe with some sickness or some nature story. And then the Lord comes there, the Lord Jesus comes, and He is seen as the Lord of this situation. The inbreaking of the Spirit of God who is operating through Jesus. And that is so powerful that as time is stopped, or the people in the situation are so overwhelmed by the power of that Spirit, that something changes. There is a change in the person's health. There's a change in the natural situation. And then usually there's a reaction. People are in awe, almost a worshiping reaction, or someone is healed. But that pattern is always there. It's too set of a pattern to think that this flows out of a number of stories that kind of happen. I think that it's talking more about this Jesus, who is this Lord of history, and using some sort of incident that they can grab a hold of, and then talk about it in the terms of this miracle that we have been trying to talk about.
Of course, it would be important for us to remember that Jesus, in his historical situation, clearly was proclaimed as a miracle worker, and that there's no doubt that he really was. I think that there's a lot of evidence, the fact that you have the gospel accounts agreeing on this kind of thing. But more than that, we don't have negative evidence. That is, the opponents of Jesus, the early Christians, never challenged this. They challenged a lot of things about Jesus. There was even a charge by the 2nd century that, for example, Jesus was illegitimate. So, I mean, there was no holding back in terms of making charges against the Lord. But there wasn't the charge that he was not a miracle worker.
Right.
They agreed that he's a miracle worker. They simply said he was doing that on behalf of Beelzebul, the devil figure, that he was doing it somehow for evil purposes, and that there was an evil power behind it. But the fact that he did these wondrous deeds, these marvelous kinds of things, really is not denied. And I think on that kind of evidence, we would have to say it's clear that Jesus himself did work miracles. Now, I think once that's established, we can probably go along more easily with the kind of point I think you were making, that there is a stylized account of those, that there is a set way of talking about it, and it had a very clear purpose. And that is to show that to the early Christian community that Jesus was indeed able to assist them, that he was present to them in their lives right now, and that he could do marvelous things on their behalf, and that the kingdom of God was being spread right then in their own day and time.
I agree with you, Jim. I think that the evangelists would really be putting themselves on the spot if there was not some validity to back up these stories. Why should they put themselves out on a limb? Over and over they speak about Jesus the miracle worker, and it's astonishing that they would keep giving that message out and making themselves very vulnerable to attack and ridicule.
Exactly, and that would make no sense at all, and such attack never really materialized. Therefore, we would say that the Christ of faith that's portrayed in the Gospels really is the historical Jesus, and that there's a link between them, and that indeed Jesus was this kind of miracle worker. But it would be important to keep that in some perspective also, wouldn't it? Because he didn't run around doing strange things. I mean, the temptation he received is to go up on the top of the temple and with a big crowd of people around to jump down and not get hurt. This is portrayed as a temptation given to him by the evil one, which he refuses to do. In fact, Jesus refuses to do any miracles that are for his own benefit. He won't change the stones into bread so that he has something to eat. It's much more that the miracles seem to be an attempt by Jesus to respond to human needs. I think that's maybe a way of seeing them, that it's like he walks along and he encounters some misery, some human suffering, and he has a compassionate heart, and he reaches out to heal and to touch. I suppose prime example of that, which is often used, is the cure of Peter's mother-in-law, which is such a simple kind of story and so flows so well. And Jesus, he's sick in bed, and Jesus walks up and touches and heals, and then she gets up and waits on them. You know, a homely kind of example, and perhaps typical of much of the miracle working of Jesus, a sort of on an ad hoc basis, not to create a sensation, not to gather a crowd really, but to reach out in compassion. And I suppose the other side of that is that often that then is used as the teachable moment, or the time to say that the kingdom is indeed present here. Something special. God's at work here.
But again, getting back to that point, that if we were going to talk about this Lord Jesus in our midst, one way to talk about him is as a miracle worker. And recalling those stories about him being the miracle worker, or the wonder worker, can help us to be in touch with the power of that Lord. I think a good way for me, I've used in understanding this, is in the Fiddler on the Roof, the song Miracle of Miracles. I think the little tailor who sings that song knew what miracle stories were about. So in his situation, when he wanted to express how he felt about the privilege of marrying the woman he wanted to marry, he finally could marry this young girl. What did he remember? He remembered the miracles from his tradition, from his God. God was this great miracle worker. He led his people through the Red Sea. The walls of Jericho came down. And he remembered those stories in celebrating the miracle of his life. And I think it's a good way to use those miracle stories, to recall the miracle stories, and reading them, listening to them, and saying, that's the Lord who wants to come into my life, and he wants to work miracles in my life. He wants to change my life.
That's terrific. I think that's exactly the way I would like to see it also, that to make the message current for ourselves. And what it ought to do is attune us to the miracles in our own lives, attune us to the way that the Spirit is operative here. In fact, I think that it is true that miracles go on today just as much as any other time. The difference is that perhaps we don't see the hand of God in things. I think miracles occur today when there's a certain kind of happening in our world that a person, when they view it and experience it and go through it, are able to say, there for me is God. God is doing wonderful things on my behalf. The great Lord is indeed operative in my experience. So something special happens, and we're able to see that, and we can say miracle. We can say God has done this wondrous deed. There's an aspect of that I would like to highlight about what it tells us about our own life, and what many times Jesus' miracles are tied up with this casting out of the powers of evil. Any of the things that threaten us, if it's the calming of the storm or the curing of the people who are sick in one way or another, the casting out of the power of evil. And what I think that tells us in a graphic and forceful way is that the powers of good are always stronger than the powers of evil. Jesus is more powerful than all the demons that are in conflict with him. And that it is a tremendous message of hope to us to meditate on those miracle stories. Whatever demons are assailing me now, whatever they are, whether it's jealousy or anger, or to have one's passions out of control, to think that life isn't manageable, to feel manipulated and controlled by a larger society, the demons of warfare, of political prisoners, of torture, all the demons that assail our modern world, that somehow, in the grand scheme of things, they will not have the final word. They can't triumph. They can't kill the human spirit finally. Jesus is more powerful than those demons, just as he was more powerful than the demons of his own time. And that suggests to us that we learn to rely on that power, that we turn to the Spirit, that we ask the Lord to cast those demons out for us, or in other language, we ask the Lord for strength and power to be able to manage the evil forces that assail us, to have a sustaining hope that indeed we can keep going. And very often that's exactly what we need in life, just that little bit of boost. So I think that the miracle stories has a power that way, and probably the way they function is the fact that they're good stories, as you said. They're involving. They have characters in them. They have emotions. They have the climax and the victory. And they're wonderful things that way. Perhaps, too, we ought to keep in mind that matter of faith that's involved in the Gospels. Remember, Jesus couldn't work the miracles in Nazareth. Well, there's a number of theories about that. One is that he was so ordinary that he couldn't work the miracles, that they weren't open to it. They just said, well, who's he? That's the carpenter's son. They had no expectations about him. That's one possible theory of why he couldn't work the miracles, that their faith wasn't there.
And I think another thing that we might be seeing there, Jim, is a development in the miracle story itself. That, as we said, these miracle stories were based on a historical experience of Jesus as a powerful man in the force of evil, that he indeed did change the course of history in people's lives. He did affect a change. But as people took the memory of those experiences into their life, one generation after another, they began to put this interpretation of faith on it too. That if we can believe in this Lord, those same sort of things can happen to us that happen to the people that Jesus had personal contact with. The leper, Peter's mother, the storm that's calm, the storms in our life, as you said, or the demons in our life. If we have faith, they can be overcome. This powerful Lord can touch us. So already we see, I think, in that added dimension of the miracle story that we read, of the person having faith or not having faith, I think we have an interpretation of that community talking about what does this original experience that we remember have on us today.
And it is, again, a call for their faith, right?
Yes.
In other words, when they think back, I mean, if you would read about the community in Nazareth and that he couldn't work any miracles there, it would alert you to the fact, hey, am I in any way like the people in Nazareth? Am I closing off some force here? Is Jesus too familiar to me? Or am I taking him for granted? Is there a way in which I need to stir up my own faith?
And oftentimes we see these miracle stories in the context of those believers who are outside the original group. They are the Syro-Phoenician woman. They're the pagan.
That's right.
Again, the outcast. And that has a message for that community of the 70s and the 80s, when the church began to reach out beyond that Jewish community and say, hey, people who aren't Jewish can be touched by this powerful Lord, and miracles can happen in your life.
That would have great ramifications for us again, wouldn't it? In thinking perhaps that God is denying his goodness to some particular group in our world, some group that we happen to be looking down upon. It would challenge all of the sexism and racism and excessive nationalism that we would find in our world. The scriptures are great for that, aren't they? The way Jesus broke those kind of barriers and worked miracles for people outside of his own environment, his own racial mix. That's really a good point to keep in mind. So we could read those miracle stories as being a challenge to our own narrowness.
Yes.
Our own attempt to manipulate God or have our own house God for ourselves, who is exclusively for us and not interested in other people.
In other words, that this Lord of history, again, is not under our control. He's not manipulated by sacrifices, but he is a gracious God, this miracle worker, this Lord of history, and he is. We just need faith. You don't need to be of a certain nationality. You don't need to follow a certain ritual. Again, that
faith is the key. You know, I was thinking that these stories that we're talking about really have a little different kind of character to them. There's some stories that are very simple and down to earth, like the curing of Peter's mother-in-law. And it seems like one can almost envision Jesus doing something like that. There's other stories that seem rather far-fetched and fanciful. I mean, they're the kind of stories where he casts the demons out and puts them into the pigs, and this large number of pigs go and run over a cliff. I mean, it's a little hard to imagine Jesus actually doing that. I mean, exactly what meaning that would have. I mean, the scholars often tell us that that is a legendary kind of miracle story that was known in the culture as a whole and maybe was ascribed to Jesus. Then there's other kind of miracles that don't seem to fit so well into his public life, like the transfiguration scene, where he takes the three up on the mountain and is changed before them and is dazzling and radiant and so on. It's a little hard to fit that into the synoptic story where Jesus is, they don't understand Jesus and where they don't appreciate the deeper message that he's giving, where they lack faith themselves, where they're surprised and unable to deal with his death, and where the resurrection comes as a total enlightenment to them. It's a little hard to imagine that kind of miracle actually occurring during the lifetime of Jesus. That might be a good example of the point you were making before, where the later community, so convinced that Jesus is alive and present in their midst, is able to talk about him in this way, as being the one who is illumined and clearly was ready for this resurrection event, so that it would be, again, a way of building up the people's faith. I guess you could sort of summarize that by saying that there really are different classes or types of miracle stories, the calming of the storm and the healings and the cures, which fit so well into the context of Jesus' time. Other ones which are sort of outlandish and seem to be imported from some other culture or time. And then there are the ones that may well refer to events after the resurrection of the Lord. I guess what we're after here is the whole understanding is the literary form of miracles. We're trying to say that if we read the New Testament, we're going to find a lot of miracle stories there. And it's important to be able to read them in a healthy and constructive way. We should see them as signs of the presence of the Lord, but especially signs that speak to us, that call forth a response of faith, that encourage us to try to get our beliefs in order so we're able to see God at work in our whole world. Then the miracle stories, when we hear them, really are not just foreign things. We don't have to tell our secular friends about them as though God does strange things by intervening in history and breaking the laws of nature. We'd rather say, hey, let's all look together at this common experience of ours, this world of ours. And is it not true that the Spirit is percolating up in strange and marvelous ways? Is it not true that gifts come to me that I really don't have coming, and that really there is a power at work that is often surprising?
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father John Blazer, the pastor of St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. The topic of this week's reflection was literary forms in the New Testament. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.